Today we are joined by Dr. Mark McConnell from the University of Georgia Mornell School of Forestry and Natural Resources. Dr. McConnell is a wildlife outreach faculty, and today he will discuss wildlife and forest management, including what animals like and how we can better manage forests for wildlife health and productivity. This webinar is designed to help woodland owners, foresters, tree care professionals, researchers, natural resource managers, and concerned citizens learn how to broaden their knowledge regarding forest management for wildlife and how we can use this knowledge to help improve the health of our forests. The title of Dr. McConnell's webinar is Integrative Wildlife Management, and with that, I will turn it over to Dr. McConnell. Mark?
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I see some people are still trickling in, but we'll go ahead and get started, and then if they have any questions for the first parts, they can catch us at the end. So just a brief outline of what we're going to talk about today. Generally speaking, just what is a healthy forest, because there's a lot of ways we can define that. In general, I'm going to talk predominantly about southern forest, or at least eastern United States forests, and we'll talk about some of the limiting factors there for wildlife. We're going to reach into understanding natural disturbance regimes in these systems and talk about how that informs our management decisions. Since a lot of wildlife biologists either aren't trained foresters, some are, but a lot of them are, and we haven't had a lot of silviculture. We're going to talk about a little bit about stand structure basics just to make sure everyone's on the same page. Then we'll segue into some wildlife beneficial trees and plants that don't get as much attention as they probably should from wildlife forestry. And then towards the end, I'll kind of follow up with some case studies from both bottomland hardwood systems and upland pine systems to kind of tie all this together and give you some examples of how this works. So what is a healthy forest? And this is obviously going to differ by different perspectives, whether that's you're talking from the human perspective, and we've got multiple avenues there where the idea of a healthy forest may be more of an aesthetic thing than a ecosystem function perspective. And it's important when we're talking about healthy forest that we all get on the same page, and when you're talking with your clientele about what a healthy forest is. It's more than just aesthetics, although aesthetics can be a part of it. A production forester may view a healthy forest a little bit different than a pure wildlife ecologist, and there's really no need for that discongruence, but we're going to talk about making sure we're all on the same page on what a healthy forest is. So, what is a healthy forest? This is the definition from SREF, and it's a good one. The ability of a forest to maintain and perpetuate a constant high quality supply of environmental benefits, products, and a diverse plant and animal community. So we're going to operate off this definition for the rest of the talk because this is about the most encompassing definition we can come up with, and probably the best I've ever seen in terms of identifying healthy components of a forest, right? So it's beneficial products, so that's wood products, but those also diverse plant and animal communities. And these environmental benefits, that could be anything from pollinator habitat to air quality to water quality. There's no shortage of details here, but this is a pretty good definition, and this is what we're going to use as we move throughout this talk. So some people have asked me before, why are we talking about forest health and wildlife in the same talk? Well, it's very simple. Wildlife are probably the best indicator of forest health that we have. If it's a healthy forest, it's going to grow healthy wildlife populations. Wildlife and forestry have been inextricably linked together and evolved and co-evolved with each other since we have information on this. So we can't really talk about forest health, in my opinion, if we're not going to talk about wildlife communities. When you don't have wildlife communities in a forest, that's a pretty good indication that the forest isn't as healthy as, say, maybe it could be. So we can use wildlife populations, and there's no shortage of species we can use to operate as kind of a barometer for forest health. If you've got healthy wildlife populations, especially certain suites of species, that is not an accident. That is a direct result of quality-intensive forest management, and therefore that is a good indicator that you have a healthy forest. So I'll reiterate this theme throughout the talk that wildlife can be used as our barometer for forest health. And it should come as no surprise, but forest management improves forest health. Letting forests just succeed on their own, there's nothing wrong with that, but to manage for a myriad of wildlife populations and a suite of specialty species that are of conservation concern, and game species that generate lots of revenue for conservation and revenue for states. These forests have to be managed. And when you're managing forests, if you're doing it in a silvicultural way that benefits wildlife, you're doing forest health management. There's really no getting around that. So some things that are limiting kind of the temperate forests of the eastern United States, it's early successional habitat. That early successional stage of timber is by far the most dominant limiting factor for a lot of wildlife populations. And with species like grassland birds, or grassland and shrubland birds, it's been well documented that the early successional grassland shrubland groups of birds are among the most in critical or in decline throughout North America. So this is some research from David King from a few years back that looks at the seedling sapling stage of succession, so that 0 to 19 years post-harvest, that stage of a forest in the eastern U.S. and the current percentage of that age group in forest, and then the trend over time. And what you'll notice is across the southeastern region, we're operating at around somewhat down to 4 or 5%, 14%, up to maybe 40% of that early successional stage in some of these forests. And the trend for the last decade is going down in almost every state except Arkansas and Tennessee. Okay, so we're not generating a great deal of early successional habitat, largely because of changes in silvicultural practices and forest management regime. So there's no doubt that this early successional stage has become limiting in temperate eastern forests. And what's important about this is we often forget how ecologically important early successional ecosystems are. Okay, this is some work from Mark Swanson and his co-authors that really documents how important these systems are. So in an early successional stage, you've got really high species diversity both in plants and animals, and because of that, you end up with very complex food webs, which promotes a great deal of diversity, large nutrient fluxes from regenerating forests to decaying previous plant material, which creates a lot of structural complexity. And if you remember from the basic ecology class you took, maybe your second semester in college, the more diverse structural diversity you have, the more wildlife diversity you have. This creates also high spatial heterogeneity in the forest landscape, and all this leads to a broader biological diversity when you have this early successional young plant community in a forest. So there's really no shortage, there's no doubt how important this stage of succession is in forest management. Just as an example, just to give you kind of put that in context, this is some research from this great book, Sustaining for Young Forest Communities, that just shows over about a 30-year span the percent of area in young forest in that dark gray area there, and how it's declined, and correspondingly prairie warbler, American woodcock, and rough grouse abundance has also declined in a pretty interesting pattern with that same decline in young early successional forest. And the reason I show this graph is because this is a good example of game and non-game species both suffering from, or population declining from, a lack of early successional habitat. And what we find oftentimes is when you have good grouse or woodcock habitat, you often have good prairie warbler or golden-cheeked warbler, a lot of different species of passerines that actually use the same successional stage. So it's not just about game or non-game species. A lot of species depend on these early successional habitats. So when we're managing forest and we're trying to think about how to manage or what scale to manage, we need to think back to the natural disturbance regimes and then use silvicultural practices to mimic, as the best we can, both the size, scale, severity, and frequency of those natural disturbance regimes. And we typically do that through a series of different types of timber cuts, which we'll get into a little bit later. But it's very important that when we're doing these, we're trying to simulate or emulate to some degree the natural disturbance regime as best we can. So for example, this is some graph from that same book I mentioned earlier, some good information looking at different disturbance regimes in this region. What you'll notice is across the more central of the country, the Arkansas, Missouri, as you would expect, tornadoes are more prominent as the natural disturbance, and then of course, as you move closer to the East Coast, you get more hurricanes. Same thing. Same thing with the fire return interval on the right. We typically have a more intense fire return interval in certain parts of the country versus as you go north and east, that fire return interval throughout the Appalachians is actually pretty significant and important, but it's not quite as frequent as it is in other parts of the country. And this is just an example of understanding how the fire regime and a disturbance regime works and what those actual disturbances, those natural disturbances are. And when we're trying to do this, it's very important that, like I said, when we're trying to mimic them, we look at the natural versus the natural disturbance versus the harvest disturbance and try to match the severity. So, for example, a hurricane or tornado coming through and chopping up a forest, that's somewhere on the moderate to high severity of scale, but we wouldn't mimic that with, say, a single tree selection cut, which I'll get into in a second. It'd be more of a more broad encompassing forestry silvicultural treatment that would actually mimic that. And so we want to make sure we're matching the appropriate silvicultural treatment with at the right scale and disturbance of the natural disturbance regime. Excuse me. So empiric systems, so fire adapted systems. This is some work from the Boston Mountains of Arkansas that looks at the fire frequency and how it corresponded with the Cherokee, the native population density. And as you can see, the fire frequency, which is the y-axis on the right, increased very impressively as the population density did. And we all know Native Americans use prescribed fire for a variety of reasons. But I've showed this to bring up the fact that it's important when you're doing restoration ecology or just basic habitat management and you want to mimic a natural disturbance regime, a conversation has to be had on where you start that clock on a natural disturbance regime, right? Was it prior to the fire regime associated strictly with lightning strikes prior to Native Americans, or was it the disturbance regime that was very common with the Native American fire practices? And I don't know the answer to that, but it's just something we have to consider when we're trying to manage habitats for an ecosystem, a desired ecosystem, to understand what that natural disturbance was. But in general, the historic fire season across the South varied a little bit, but from a lot of the Comright brothers' work and some other work later on, we know it was late spring, early summer was a lot of the lightning strikes, and you can look up lightning strike flash densities online and look at where they're more intensive, and you can see this is some work from about 10 years up to 2014. A lot of lightning strikes down in Florida. You also see them in what we call the boot of Louisiana, which is the Florida parishes there, and of course in the southern Oklahoma and Arkansas area as well. But in general, the really frequent fire regimes that we're fond of mimicking was largely responsible for Native Americans. They were intentionally lighting fires for a lot of good reasons, and that's often the fire frequency we're trying to emulate. So what we don't want to do in terms of pyric systems or firewall systems is, I don't know how many of you remember this is from a while back, but we don't want to have to get to a point where we've excluded fire for whatever reasons to the point that, you know, we empower turkeys and quail to pick up fire rakes and drip torches, right? We want to be doing this to manage for these species especially, but in general, several other species that are adapted to frequent fire. So some work from Ron Masters talks, this is just a sample of his work from the shortleaf pine work he did in mixed oak pine systems. But what he's talking about here is what the forest community and the subsequent avian community looks like in two different scenarios, one with fire seclusion and then one with frequent 1 to 5 year return intervals. And what you see here, this graph, is what the successional stage and the associated avian population looks like across that successional stage when fire is excluded. And what you'll see is mourning dove, for example, which you can see down here on the right, only within a very short range of that successional stage in that forest because fire's been excluded and you've got the structural conditions are no longer conducive for mourning dove or northern bobwhite. So you've got this real narrow range of where these species can occupy when you have fire excluded. In contrast, when you look at that same system with the 1 to 5 year return interval, you see mourning dove and bobwhites, the range of that system that they can actually exploit and benefit from pretty much covers the entire spectrum. So by returning that natural fire regime to that system, or mimicking that natural fire regime, you've expanded basically the usable space, we'll call it, that certain species can exploit. You see the same thing with pine warbler and prairie warbler and some other species. And this is just to show you that as you change the forest structure through disturbance, you change the wildlife populations that can exploit it. And you can see this with small mammals and large mammals as well. just birds are an easier example, so I use it. We do know what happens when we exclude fire completely, though. This is from Tall Timbers Research Station. This is in the site MV66. It's had fire suppression for, well, I guess now over 50 years. And this is what it looked like in 1966, and then they stopped burning, and then in 81, and then 2001, it's obviously converted to a much different system than you would expect. And with this comes a different suite of avian species, typically a lower diversity, but in general, a shift in the avian community and the wildlife community as a whole that can exploit this. So we want to understand the results of fire exclusion and fire return frequencies. Switching gears, if you're working in riparian systems, the disturbance regime is a little bit different. Flooding is the primary disturbance regime we typically think about in bottomland systems, especially in places like the Mississippi Alluvial Valley. And when it comes to flooding, the timing of that flooding, so the timing of year, the duration, how long that water stays, and the frequency, how often a year this happens, directly dictates not only the understory community and the herbaceous vegetation that a lot of wildlife benefit, but that ridge and swell system influences the tree canopy species, the codominant and dominant species that occur in that forest, which has direct impacts on which wildlife can exploit those forests. So when we're working in bottomland systems, flooding is one of the major disturbance regimes we often try to mimic, and via green tree reservoirs and things of that sort, but it's not the only one, right? We also have a lot of wind throw, tornado, hurricane, thunderstorm damage, and this creates a lot of disturbance in these systems and pine systems as well. But where it opens up the canopy, light comes down, and you get a new stage of succession in small pockets throughout a forest. And this is something we often try to mimic in bottomland systems, especially with certain silvicultural treatments. If you're working in riparian systems, like I said, I'm trying to make this as encompassing for as many states as possible, but if you're in riparian systems, it's important to know where you are on the floodplain. And this is something I don't think we do a good enough job of understanding, is where along the system we are in terms of our elevation and what type of soil we're actually dealing with, because that obviously dictates the plant community. So understanding where you are on the floodplain, and then how that translates to which species you can actually expect to see in terms of tree species. So if you're on that first levee coming off the main channel, the plant community you see with a lot of river birch, willow, and cottonwood is drastically different than a very similar elevation on the first low ridge or the first high ridge, where you could switch from a green ash, sweet gum, willow oak forest dominated to something like overcup, green ash, and maple. Two different systems would be managed differently for those tree species, in addition to how you would manage them for wildlife. So I emphasize this just to point out that we often want to think about where we're at on that hydrological gradient, so we know which species we can get through regeneration, and what type of disturbance and frequency of disturbance we're actually going to be dealing with. And that translates down to, if you're trying to regenerate certain species, there are certain silvicultural systems that favor certain species, and I'll leave this up here if you can go look back at it later. I'm not going to go through all this, but there's certain silvicultural systems you can employ that actually favor certain species, and we can use that to our advantage. Okay, getting in a little into stand structure basics, just so we understand where we're all talking about throughout this talk. Like I said, if you never had a silvicultural course, or you haven't worked in an intensive forest system, this is important to know. The understory is what we often think about, especially when we're talking about wildlife species and forested systems, is managing that understory. It doesn't get much light, depending on the tree density. A lot of tolerant to shade species are there. And that's often where we're trying to directly affect the wildlife community, is at the understory level, right? So we'll just say from 20 meters down, but that may vary. The canopy is above that, and you can see here on the graph here, the canopy is the majority of the trees you're going to be dealing with. We often don't think about those very much from a wildlife standpoint unless we're dealing with a species that we know is using the canopy, but how we manage the canopy directly influences the understory and the ground layer. And then you've got your emergent trees that are above the canopy, and I'll show you an example later why these can be important for some wildlife species, but they're usually the trees most vulnerable to the wind damage, and they're generally above the canopy. So I'm going to use these terms throughout the talk, but this should give you a good example of kind of what, when I say understory, what the layer of the forest that I'm actually referring to. In general, wildlife likes diversity. Okay, we all know this. Think back to that first ecology class you took that probably hammered into our heads nonstop: diversity and structural diversity and wildlife diversity. In a forested system, that's both vertical and horizontal, right? So that's talking about the understory, the midstory, the canopy, the emergent trees, and then looking through that forest, how that affects the horizontal and structural and vertical density. Vines, all these things go into structural diversity. And with that, we also want to look for our species diversity in systems where we can. In predominant pine systems, it's a little harder to work on tree species diversity because it's a production system. In bottomland hardwoods, it's a little easier because we already have so many species there. But this comes down to competing objectives. If you're in a bottomland hardwood system or you have a lot of different tree species, managing your objectives and trying to find that optimum point where you can produce wood products in a productive, economically productive manner, but also manage for wildlife species. We just have to evaluate all those to try to find a way to balance that. When you're doing management, especially in hardwood forest, but not just in hardwood forest, very important to understand shade tolerance classification. There's a lot of misinformation on tolerance of species. Oaks tend to get this intermediate level classification, although that can vary by species to some degree. But things like sweet gum we know are fairly intolerant, and they are rough as soon as you open the canopy. But things like persimmon, which we're often trying to manage for or trying to promote, pretty tolerant of shade and do well, you know, when the canopy opens up. But you can actually retain some in a shaded environment longer than some other species. So just understanding how these species respond to shade, and this is important because when you go do an inventory and you're looking through a forest and you're trying to change the structural dynamic there to benefit wildlife, if you look down at what's in the advanced regeneration stage, right? So what regenerated species, hardwood species, are actually getting up above your waist or maybe over your head in that advanced stage. When you open up that canopy, it's important to understand how those species are going to respond and how the species maybe under them that have been suppressed by shade are going to respond when the sunlight hits. So understanding shade tolerance is how we can strategically manipulate forests to promote the species we want to promote. Okay, so some general things here, and we won't spend too much time on these, but one of the more popular, used to be more popular silvicultural systems, clear cut, right? It's an even age regeneration system. You're pretty much taking every tree out, although sometimes there's some residual non-merchantable trees left. It's great for, you get a lot of advanced regeneration. There's a lot of seeds out there. It creates this really thick, if you ever walk through a clear cut in the southeast after 5 years, you probably only make it about 20 feet before you give up. But it can be really beneficial for wildlife depending on the species you're managing. It's pretty easy to implement. We've got some issues or some restrictions now with the Sustainable Forestry Initiative on what size we try to recommend and what size of clear cut you can get away with. It's not very aesthetically pleasing to the public, although if you're an early successional wildlife biologist and you like species like yellow-breasted chats or bobwhite or rabbits, you know, I think they're rather beautiful. But I've been challenged on that. But basically removing everything, and then you're going to give your shade intolerant species are going to show that fast, the greatest initial growth, because if they're intolerant to shade, you've just removed the shade, and now they're going to have a competitive advantage. Something that's much more popular, I think, is shelter woodcuts. Also a way to do even age regeneration. It says here 50% of the first entry, but it varies by whatever system you're in and which type of management you're trying to do. It doesn't alter the hydrology as much. You've all seen a clear cut where, you know, after the clear cut, the water, it floods really easily because the water table has been, pushed up. You don't see that as much with shelter wood simply because you're retaining more trees. But it's pretty good for effective oak regeneration, mainly because oaks in that intermediate shade tolerance, you've got a lot of new sun there, but you've also got a fair amount of shade, and that those retained trees are providing shelter for that. It's great for wildlife, a little more difficult to implement because it takes a little more objective direction, but a great silvicultural practice. Single tree selection is my absolute favorite just because you can get a little bit artistic with it, and you're talking about individual species or groups of species and individual trees that you're trying to remove to affect a very specific structural outcome in that area. It's much more visually pleasing. A lot of people, the public's not nearly as opposed to it, but it's difficult to apply. And if you don't have training, and if you haven't done it before, it can be kind of daunting because you're actually walking through and marking actual trees you want to remove or species of trees you want to remove. But a great practice nonetheless. One you'll hear a lot about today probably is group selection cut. We do this mainly to mimic tree fall gaps from tornadoes, hurricanes, or thunderstorms. Well, not hurricanes so much, but thunderstorms, where you go in and you just remove a certain area. It could be a quarter acre, it's up to 3 acres. I worked in Louisiana for a while, and they would get very creative in their group selection cuts and do a lot of different shapes and sizes to simulate the natural disturbance regime. Pretty low visual impact, great for wildlife, for a lot of species, and you can come in and take out trees periodically to mimic this disturbance. Just an example comparing single tree selection to group selection, all these dots being individual trees. On the left, you've got the single tree selection. We're actually removing individuals, and just to give you an example from a bird's eye view, a group selection looks more like that on the right. We're actually taking out all the trees in a specific area to some degree. So, switching gears one more time to what I call beyond the oaks. Oaks are great for wildlife. There's no doubt about it. A myriad of species eat acorns and hard mass, but oaks, I think, get a little too much attention at the expense of some other species that are also good for wildlife that we can actually promote to create a more diverse wildlife population. So I'm going to go through a few hardwood species that are great for wildlife that don't get a great deal of attention, and then I'll follow up with a few herbaceous species as well. So sugarberry, Celtis laevigata. Not your greatest tree in the world, but it produces this fruit that is actually really beneficial to a lot of wildlife species. Turkeys in particular actually love the fruit from sugarberry. It's not a great forest product, but a lot of people cut it, and depending on what market you're selling, you can get arguably some money for it, but it's a great wildlife tree. I'm not recommending we start retaining every sugarberry because in some forests there's way too many, but some retention of sugarberry is actually relatively beneficial for a lot of species. Turkeys, yellow warblers, wood thrush, cedar waxwings, just to name a few, will actually consume this fruit in high demand. And if you're marking timber, you're out in the system, you see a very mature, very productive sugarberry, and it doesn't necessarily have to go to maintain your objective. It's nice to not only retain this tree, but thin out a little bit around it to actually give that tree a better, more sunlight exposure and reduce its competition to increase its mass production. So sugarberry, great wildlife tree that doesn't get near enough recognition. Dogwoods. We're not making any money off dogwoods really anyway, but they're a great wildlife tree. They're very aesthetically pleasing and a suite of species, including wild turkey, chickadees, yellow-rumped warblers, a lot of squirrels, cardinals as well. They all consume dogwood, whether it's roughleaf or flowering dogwood. When you're out in the systems and you're marking timber, you're undoubtedly going to encounter dogwoods, and there's usually not that many, so it doesn't take a lot of effort to actually retain some of these. They also provide a fair amount of structural diversity in the system, in the forest system, because they usually don't get that big. They have wide branching leaves, and they provide an additional structural component. Black locust and honey locust. What growing up in Louisiana, we call these bean trees. And when you had a really productive bean tree in Louisiana, that was where you bow hunted because you knew a good buck was going to come trying to eat these beans in the pods here. Careful though, one of them, they have the thorns on them. The honey locust, I can't remember if black locust does or not. So be careful with the thorns. But black bears love these. A lot of birds love them, and they're very beneficial for whitetails. So if you've got a locust tree, you can cut it, and some people they used to make a lot of fence posts out of it. They're very rot-resistant wood, but it's a really good wildlife tree to actually retain that doesn't get a fair amount of attention from the wildlife community. Switching gear to some woody shrubs and vines, and y'all know most of this, I'm sure you do, but I just want to reemphasize there's probably nothing more important in the southeast, especially than rubus, the species of rubus. Blackberries, dewberries, they're by far one of the most important plants in the southeast. Whitetails, cottontails, numerous songbirds, small mammals, all eat the fruit, eat the leaves. It's a very beneficial species. Things like scarlet tanager in that picture there. For most of the states in the southeast, or a few of the states in the southeast, we get those during migration. But in addition to that, They're great escape and loafing cover for small game species. If you've ever hunted rabbits, you've undoubtedly gotten rabbits out of blackberry thicket. Northern bobwhite love to use blackberry thickets to loaf during the day and escape predators. I got a plantation in South Georgia that tells me the bobwhite, the coveys will actually hold in the blackberry bushes because their dogs will just point all around the bush and the birds won't come out, and they'll have to send an English cocker in there to flush the birds out. So they're great escape and loafing cover from predators, and it's a great wildlife plant all around. Everyone knows deer like greenbrier, but what you may not know is rough grouse, wild turkey, and bobwhites all eat the fruit of greenbrier as well. 40-plus documented songbirds will eat the fruit of greenbrier. It's obviously a preferred deer browse. Just about every rabbit you're ever going to encounter will eat greenbrier. There's a bunch of different species in the Smilax genus, but the only way you get greenbrier and blackberry is by opening up the canopy, and you've got to remove trees to do that. So when you're opening up the canopy, you're promoting this early successional habitat. These are some of the species that you're going to get from that silvicultural decision that are going to benefit wildlife. Poison ivy and poison oak. People don't believe me when I tell them this, but deer love poison ivy. It's a great deer browse. Okay, it doesn't affect them the way it affects us. And if you ever do a herd check and you're looking through
Mark, can I jump in for a second?
You're going to find poison ivy.
Hey, it sounds like there's somebody out there that has a cell phone or something that's not muted, and it's distracting. So if you're on your cell phone, please make sure you're not talking or make sure it's muted. Okay, folks? All right, thanks. Go ahead, Mark.
No problem. Like I said, numerous songbirds consume the fruit. Things like northern flicker, which is one of the woodpeckers, yellow-bellied sapsuckers, also eat the fruit. The birders like to watch these species, swamp rabbits especially. I looked really hard to make sure I could find a picture of a deer eating poison ivy, and there it is. So poison ivy, as much as we hate it, it's great. I worked on a management area in Louisiana that every tree had poison ivy just wrapped around, and we couldn't even use a D-tape around it because the poison ivy vines were so thick. But when we did, deer loved it, and deer were in really good condition there because it's got a fair amount of nutrition and palatability. We all know that grapes are good, Vita species, wild grape especially, the muscadine, which we're all most familiar with. Everything from black bear, deer, turkeys, grouse, raccoons, a lot of small mammals like them. It's a preferred deer forage. It's also eaten by numerous songbirds. But in addition to just the food component, much like blackberry, when you get muscadine especially in these really big thickets like this picture on the bottom right, that creates a fair amount of structural diversity, and it can get too bad and you can choke out trees, but it's a great loafing place. I've seen turkeys nest under these things. I've seen bobwhite loaf under them. It's a great structural component in a forest system for wildlife. So the Vita species also, you're not going to get it without opening up the canopy. And bow hunters love these in the southeast because they drop right about the time bow season starts. So deer hit them very hard. One of my least favorite plants on the planet, but only from a personal standpoint, is American Beautyberry. Also 40-plus documented species of songbirds eat the fruit. Things like gray catbird here, I've got this picture, of cedar waxwings, which we get during migration. It's medium browse preference for deer. But the deer do eat the fruit pretty heavily in the later fall. Bobwhites, raccoons, even armadillos will eat this. USDA recently, a few years ago, showed that it's actually really good at repelling mosquitoes. So you can actually take the leaves and rub them on you, and it'll actually serve as a pretty effective mosquito repellent. So just an added benefit. But if you've ever marked timber in a pine system, you probably hate beautyberry, as I do. But it's actually a pretty positive wildlife species that doesn't get enough credit. So I'll switch now to some bottomland hardwood management. I don't know how many people we have from states that are working in bottomland systems, but I'll go through some bottomland stuff, and then I'll end with some upland pine examples. In general, we want to take advantage of the fact that we have greater tree species diversity, right? So we want to manage for multi-tree species composition in that forest in multiple size classes, and that's from a regeneration and making sure you have volume to cut over time, but also just to add structural diversity. Canopy gaps are the really big thing we're trying to mimic in these hardwood systems, and we do that through a group selection cut like we talked earlier. So you want to create a desirable structure, but you also want to be promoting regeneration, so you actually have something to cut down the line. So we can model and work together with maintaining a consistent forest product via timber volume, but also increase wildlife populations at the same time. In hardwood systems, you're probably going to sacrifice some timber production, and this is from the Lower MAV Joint Venture Working Group that put this together. But commercially viable, wildlife-oriented silviculture, what they call wildlife forestry, is definitely an option, and it's definitely doable. It just takes a little bit of know-how on which species you want to promote, and optimizing your ability to produce revenue and generate wildlife habitat. But it can be done. It's done all the time, especially in states like Louisiana, who I would argue their state agency does probably the best I've ever seen in terms of managing hardwood timber for wildlife. In general, though, the species in these systems want structurally diverse, species-rich forest, right? Large trees and frequent canopy gaps. And that's easy to do through a bunch of different silvicultural methods, but what you're trying to do is mimic that disturbance that was naturally occurring through there. And what we found is, and this is the same with longleaf pine and fire, we see the same thing in bottomwood hardwoods, the historic disturbances are kind of spatially and temporally restricted than what they used to be, right? So back in the day, if a thunderstorm came through in August and lit up a longleaf forest, that forest could burn hot and long for thousands of acres. Well, and it may not happen as often as we burn now, but it was that intense of a fire that you had a similar effect. Now we can't burn thousands of acres at a time, so we burn smaller acreage more frequently to try to mimic that disturbance regime. It's the same thing in hardwood systems. If a tornado or a thunderstorm comes in, the forests are not as intact and as large, so you take what you can get in little areas. So we're trying to mimic that disturbance regime as best we can. A lot of the species in hardwood systems, a lot of that is due to fragmentation due to agricultural conversion and other things you've seen. I'm sure you've seen pictures of the MAV and the reduction we've seen in the last 100 or so years to ag conversion. But for forest birds, which get a lot of attention and are a great indicator of ecosystem health, when you have small patches of forest, you have all these expected things: more competition, greater disturbance, increased isolation. But one of the things that we definitely know is you get increased brood parasitism from cowbirds, brown-headed cowbirds. So by managing large forest and getting large forest on the ground, we can actually circumvent a lot of these negative effects. So a case study involving this is the cerulean warbler, one of really neat neotropical migrants. It's a passerine, it's a small bird. It's a pretty little blue color, but we know that they like complex vertical structure. They want to see super emergent trees follow next to near canopy gaps to create the conditions that they've kind of evolved in. And this is kind of a complex structure. So what we know is that we can manage for this, for their foraging and their nest sites, if we have gaps intermixed with dominant shade-intolerant trees and expansive crowns that are overtopping large shade-tolerant trees. So basically using group selection cuts to mimic the forest conditions that cerulean warbler, which is a species of conservation concern, to mimic the forest dynamics that they evolved with while also generating revenue, because we're oftentimes in bottomless systems we're already doing group selection cuts. So we can do these in an intentional framework for both forest health, forest productivity, and wildlife. One of my favorite species, the Swanson's warbler, they typically evolved in hardwood and mixed hardwood systems around cane breaks associated with switch cane that often occur. You only get switch cane if you have a canopy gap, right? If you've ever walked through the woods and you walk up on switch cane, you look up and there's a gap in the forest, right? They need a lot of sunlight. And a lot of the reason we've lost cane is because we don't have very many openings in the forest. But Swanson's warbler like it as thick as you can get it. And we've got some new research that shows that it doesn't have to be cane. It can be saplings, shrubs, or vines, anything just that creates that thick structural complexity they'll utilize. And we can also achieve that through group selection harvest, because you're creating a small area, or small is a subjective term, but generally small area compared to the rest of the forest that is wide open to a great deal of sunlight, that you get a lot of this regeneration They also use rhododendron thickets in different parts of the eastern forest because it's not as thick perhaps as switch cane, but the structural similarities are vast, and Swanson's warblers are capable of exploiting those as well. So just an example of using an intensive forestry practice, or another example of using that to promote a wildlife species of concern. Some of Dan Tweet's work and Randy Wilson's work. Dan Tweet's with USGS. He's a great ornithologist and researcher, as is Randy Wilson with his migratory bird biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the MAV. And this is some research they did in Louisiana, looking at abundance of different species so many years post-harvest. So this is a collection of what they call wildlife forestry silvicultural treatments, a lot of group selection, individual selection cuts mixed together. And what I'm going to show you here is how species abundance changes over the lifespan of that harvest. And this is a yellow-breasted chat, really likes thick early successional habitat. Their populations aren't in a steep decline as a lot of others, but they really exploit these early successional habitats. And what you'll see here is in year 1 and year 2 and year 3 years post-harvest in these treatments, when the canopy was open and a lot of sunlight comes in, you get this massive growth of a lot of early successional plants, a lot of oak trees as well, elderberry, blackberry, you get all these great things. It gets really thick, and you really see yellow-breasted chats exploit that, and their capture rates go up significantly in those areas, and then it slowly declines. So as succession succeeds, and that structural component they like starts to fade out through competition and more shade on the ground, you see their populations go down. Whereas 10 years post-harvest, you don't catch very many chats. So just an example of the type of forest structure that they exploit. White-eyed vireo is a little bit different, and Kentucky warblers as well. Both like early successional habitat. Kentucky warblers more of a shrubland species, but you'll find them a lot in bottomland systems. Both species tend to peak between, you'll say, years 6 and 8 or 9 post-harvest. So a little bit different stage in that successional plane and that successional timeline that they exploit. That we can provide these multiple structural components by having different timed group selection or individual selection cuts throughout a forest, so that the successional stages that multiple species want occurs somewhat evenly distributed across the landscape. Hooded warblers and Swansons show really different trends. The Swanson's warblers, obviously, when it gets really thick, year 8 through peak in year 8 or 9, and another peak in year 13. I don't really know what that dip there is about, but compared to, say, hooded warblers, who really only start to really dominate that system, and 13 or 14 years post-harvest. So I show you these just to give an example of the different successional stages after a cut, and how by doing different timed cuts throughout the span of a forest, you can create these multiple diverse structural systems that benefit to increase your avian diversity, which, like I said, is a very good indicator of ecosystem health. Some other work they did just looks at all the species that showed positive response to what they call these wildlife forestry silvicultural treatments. This is data from both hardwood forests and some upland hardwood forests, some bottomlands and hardwoods. And what you'll notice here, a lot of these species are not only species of conservation concern, things like Kentucky warbler, parulas, painted buntings, especially species here. Looks like somebody just went to town with a paintbrush on that bird. Indigo buntings. Also, but even things like mourning doves, the most popular game species probably in the eastern United States, also benefit from these different silvicultural treatments. I'll skip through that for the sake of time. Some work from Mike Chamberlain's lab at LSU, also with Dan Tweed and grad student Jennifer Norris, looked at no treatment at NOT, so that's your control, individual selection, IND, and then group selection, GRP, and then the extensive forestry, which was a combination of group selection and silviculture. And what you'll notice is for different species, they had different responses. In the first panel here, yellow-breasted chat obviously benefited from the group selection more. So did wood thrush and Kentucky warblers. But what's interesting is some species, like Acadian flycatcher, which is more adapted to exploiting the more mature canopy of a forest, they actually did better under the no treatment at all or the individual selection. Same thing with prothonotary warblers on the bottom right. The individual selection they benefited more there than they did the group selection. So I show you this to simply point out that not always is the most intensively possible silviculture treatment the best for all species, but a combination therein or thereof can actually, having some areas that aren't cut to benefit species like Acadian flycatcher or great Kessler flycatcher, and then some cuts in there to also benefit your more early successional species is really beneficial. Everyone likes black bear, so I threw a few black bear stuff in there. Also benefit from diversity in forest species and structure, and that's a good thing. We want that. Typically, managing for hard and soft mast is really important for these species. They eat acorns of all shapes and sizes, sweet pecan, everything. They also eat a lot of agricultural, soybeans and corn, palmetto berries, beautyberry, a lot of different things all go in there, and it's all good for black bear. So managing early successional, open up the canopy to promote these soft mass producing species is really beneficial. In general, these are a list of species, and I won't go through all these for the interest of time, that you can look through and see which species that beneficial for black bears. Things like pokeberry don't get a lot of attention because they're not very ubiquitous, but they like them, and it can be a pretty important soft mass species for them. Also, in terms of managing your timber, excavated or natural depressions, stumps, fallen logs, large 36 diameter dBH plus trees can be used as den sites, which is can arguably be limiting sometimes for black bears. Obviously, you want these places in areas that are not flooded during denning season, but so retention of some of these older class non-merchantable trees is somewhat beneficial. And then, of course, thick palmetto and switch cane bears like. For one, they'll den in that stuff sometimes, but also it's important to scape cover. In bottomlands, turkeys are real popular game species, so hardwoods are critically important. You want to retain both bottomland hardwoods and some mixed pine hardwood stands. Hard mass is pretty important, but you also want to have a fair amount of early successional habitat for nesting and brood rearing, and that's an important one as well. Turkeys have a more diverse diet than probably people give them credit for. Here's a list, but they also like a fair amount of grasses, shrubs, and forbs that attract insects for brooding. And if you've ever been seen a bunch of turkey scratchings under some oak trees, they're flipping over those leaves looking for invertebrates. So a couple different structural systems you can manage for turkeys there. In general, you want to have, and this goes for any species, but I'll use turkey as an example, and there's a quail example here on the right, whereas when you have all the components they need, like for example, quail need agricultural shrubs, grass, and woodlands, and when you have all four of those where they're touching, a quail can exist there. But in that bottom panel, when you have each one in a smaller component, more interspersed, you can actually hold more coveys. Same thing with turkeys. You want to have roosting cover, brood habitat, all these things interspersed, so they're all occurring. So turkeys have to spend less time and energy moving from roosting habitat, say, to brood rearing habitat. The more they walk, the larger chance they have of getting eaten. Everyone likes deer in the southeast and eastern part of the U.S., so I'll just make a plug here for this. Different systems, forest systems, have different average crude proteins in the available forage for deer. This is some research from Mike Chamberlain's lab at LSU. So up to 12% protein for swamp hardwoods, down to maybe 7% average in your forage for maybe historic longleaf. And the reason I say this is you can manage your expectations. When you're promoting early successional habitat by cutting forests in these systems, you want to promote good, high-quality forage for deer. Deer can eat 5 to 10 pounds of forage a day. So you want to you've got the soil and the system that can give you enough good habitat and good forage. You want to make sure you're maximizing what you've got, the soil conditions you've got, by opening up the canopy and allowing that forage to grow and grow abundantly, because protein has a pretty big impact on deer growth. Here's some looking at low and high protein diets with deer antlers of the same age, and then some research from Mississippi State on the bottom here that shows the average Boone and Crockett score for a high versus low protein diet. So managing for protein for whitetails, if that's a goal, is managing the forest for early successional forage and browse, which you're only going to get from cutting timber. Same thing, research from Marcus Lashley in North Carolina showed that If you reduce the canopy and add prescribed fire, you can drastically increase nutritional carrying capacity for whitetails, and that's a really good thing to do. So simply by managing the forest for health, which we do with fire and thinning, you're actually benefiting wildlife. Switching gears a little bit, another case study with rough grouse. This graph on the top right just shows that when you need about 25%, or in this case 25% early successional forest was the way to keep the number of female grouse going up, so the population growing. When you had less early successional forest than that, your population was declining. You also saw that survival increased with the proportion of percent of early successional forest in that landscape. So managing for early successional forest also good for rough grouse, which is a species declining in most areas. All right, switching gears real quick to upland forest management. The big thing we get with pine production is when to thin, how to thin, where to thin. Well, first of all, you got to thin. It's inevitable. There's a lot of risk to not thinning, and anytime you thin, you're going to benefit wildlife. It's that simple. If you don't thin, you're pretty much compromising the forest health and, of course, the wildlife potential. So some competition is inevitable. You can't have all the trees you planted forever, so you can either let nature do it and lose a bunch of money and decrease the wildlife potential and the forest health and invite a bunch of insect outbreaks, or you can thin and actually get merchantable value from those trees that are going to die anyway while increasing wildlife and increasing forest health. This is a stand in Mississippi that we're doing some research on right now. It is a loblolly stand that is past thinning age. It should have already been thinned, and what you can see is it's doing here is it's self-thinning. Okay, those trees on the ground were standing. So the competition has got in there. It's self-thinning. You're starting to see some poor growth form. You're starting to see trees fall over. This is not a healthy forest, and we're about to cut this and start burning it, which will make it better. But this is what happens when you've missed your first thinning window. You start to get self-thinning, and you're losing not only revenue, but risking forest health and decreasing wildlife populations. So like I said, in pine systems, the more you thin, the more sunlight you're going to get. Most of your wildlife beneficial plants are going to be more intolerant of shade on that spectrum. So you want to thin. For turkeys, we typically recommend 60 to 90 square feet of basal area per acre. For quail, you've got to be less than 65 in most systems to be productive. 30 to 40 is ideal, but that's often not conducive with production timber goals. If you're not familiar with what basal area looks like, here's a 100 square foot of basal area in a loblolly pine versus 50 square feet of basal area, and look at the big difference between the forage quality. If you were a quail or a turkey trying to make a living in that 100 square foot area, one, you're exposed to a lot of predators. Two, there's not a lot of forage there comparatively. If you're in a 50 square foot per acre, one, you're more concealed when you're foraging on the ground, as your chicks will be, but two, there's a lot more forage and a lot more usable space. Here's some examples of what happens before and after you thin, what kind of response you get if you thin low enough, and you've noticed that it's a substantial increase in the wildlife quality of that habitat. In pine systems, we often get a lot of beautyberry, blackberry, blueberry, and persimmon, depending on the soils when we thin, and these are all, as we discussed earlier, really important for wildlife from a food standpoint and structurally, so it's important to have. For bobwhite quail, we know definitively, and this has been reproduced multiple times, but this is some research from Tall Timbers that shows that as your basal area increases, your covey numbers go down, so you see this pretty linear decline in bobwhite abundance as your basal area gets too high. It's because bobwhite need a lot of sunlight on the ground for early successional habitat. In general, when you thin, you're going to get better bedding cover for fawns if you're managing for deer. You're going to get better nesting habitat and brooding for quail and turkeys. It's better forage for deer. You're going to increase the plant diversity, increase the avian diversity, and also increase your insect diversity. And that insect diversity is very important for bobwhite chicks and turkey chicks, not to mention other songbird species. Those chicks need a lot of protein the first few weeks of their lifespan to put on feather growth. So it's an important component to have. I think I'm going to skip through some of this for the interest of time. So I think I'm probably getting close to running over. We talked about fire and understanding the disturbance regime and the natural regime and trying to mimic that if you can, or if that's what your goals mean or your goals set. But the one thing I want to mention here is if you're thinning, but not burning, you're not going to get in a pine system, you're not going to get the desired result. Same thing, if you're burning and not thinning, which I see a lot on certain areas, you're not going to get what you want. So the two they're inseparable. You can't thin and not burn, you can't burn and not thin to get the most optimum wildlife response. So I stress, if you're a state manager on your state property or federal lands or your private lands, these two things need to go hand in hand to get a desired wildlife response. The timing and frequency is going to depend on your objectives and your soil. If you're in a high rainfall area and it's a high productivity site, you can get away with a lot more burning, and you have a wider breadth of timings you can burn. But if you're in a poor soil area with not a lot of rainfall, you're limited. But in general, just about everything is going to benefit from a systematic, controlled, prescribed fire. There's really no debate about that. If you're not familiar with prescribed fire, here's some examples of before and after same stands. You see you get up that pine duff layer. You also promote a lot of species diversity, and you get pretty good growth in those systems once they get enough light and they've had fire. You get some pretty good early successional habitat. Excuse me. The timing depends on your goals, but a dormant season fire is typically better for forage production and fruit production, whereas a growing season fire is typically better for hardwood control, which is what a lot of us are trying to find some balance in there to get the best of both worlds. Like I said, our general recommendations for most early successional species is 2 to 3 years, depending on your soil type. But here's some examples of unburned stand, what it looks like in the southeast, with a winter burn in a 3-year cycle, a winter burn on a 2-year cycle, and then a winter burn on a 1-year cycle. And you can see the plant community drastically changes with that frequent fire regime. And with that structural and plant species response, the wildlife community drastically changes too. So understanding which wildlife populations you're going to get with each approach here is vitally important to achieving whatever goals you may have. Here's an example of infrequent and frequent fire on the left, and this is similar to what we saw from tall timbers. This is actually from tall timbers. The structural complexity and amount of sunlight hitting the floor is drastically different, but fire or no fire, that's about as good a picture as you're ever going to get. If you're dealing with turkeys, which a lot of us are, especially in state areas, your recently burned stands, 0 to 6 months since fire, they're pretty highly selected, especially for brooding habitat. For foraging habitat, and then hens are going to brood in those stands in that 1 to 2 year period, so they've got the most insects and most cover. But they're going to nest in, say, that 2 to 4 years post fire, because that's going to have the best nesting structure and better concealment. So having part of the area in a 2 to 4 year post burn, some in a 1 to 2 year post burn, is only going to benefit turkeys and also create a bunch of structural and plant diversity that is going to benefit both forest health and wildlife. All right, I'm going to wrap up here with just some examples of some of this integrated management. This is from a research demonstration on a refuge in Mississippi, where they did a thin down to about 50, 60 square feet per acre, then did another commercial hardwood removal, then left some big mass producing trees, came in with a skidder and put some 32 ounces of chopper Gen 2, and then the next year followed up with a burn, and I'll show you what this looks like. So this is the stand before treatment, 2007. Hardly any grass out there. This is, historically a pine-dominated system. Hardly any grass out there, mostly sweet gum. Not terribly great wildlife habitat, although some species would use this. They came in and did the harvest. This is what it looks like after the harvest. So drastically reduced the basal areas you can see here, down to 50 to 60 square feet per acre. This is what it looked like post-harvest. Okay. Typically what you'd expect, nothing growing yet. Came in early in fall of 2008 with chopper Gen 2 at 32 ounces per acre and really nuked the site. And then we followed that up in the winter of 2009 with a pretty substantial prescribed burn. And this is what we ended up with. Okay, so a drastic change in the forest structure, a drastic change in the plant community. There is now native grass here. This is a little blue stem. There's a lot more grass out here, some signal grass and other things. We promoted a grass understory, or released it, better is the word. There's still some oaks here generating hard mast, but it's also, this is much more indicative of a managed pine system. And what we found here when we monitored this population, the bird response was pretty significant. We had no Bachman sparrows, which is a grassland kind of prairie obligate species, in 2007. And then 2008 and 2009, their populations went up. The northern bobwhite population skyrocketed under this management regime, which is the bird most people are looking for in these kind of systems, as did eastern wood pewee, which is another interesting pine grassland bird. So a lot of good wildlife response to this intensive forestry practice. Another example is from Wes Berger's work and Eric Secunder's work in Tennessee several years ago. This is Ames Plantation, where they host the national field trial, bird dog field trial. Their population had been kind of going down, and they realized they had been burning, but they kind of just let the forest get out of hand. So they came in with a really intensive hardwood removal in these areas of red here, and I'll show you exactly what that looked like. So when I say a big hardwood removal, I mean a big hardwood removal. They took out a lot of hardwood basal area and really cleaned this place up, as you can see here, and then drastically reduced the timber volume, and then restored native prescribed fire. And what we saw with the bobwhite population was, this is the overwinter survival, which is a pretty critical, which is the most critical time period for bobwhite in terms of population growth. So the green line is the areas they removed, the control is the red line, so the remaining property they didn't remove timber from, and then that dotted line there's the overall survival. And what we saw was, we didn't see much of a little bit of a difference in 98, 99, but then once that stand started to really regenerate and the native plant community came back, we saw a major increase in the overwinter survival on this population, and it was higher than the survival was on the non-treated area. So we're looking at 36% to somewhat around 47%, so about a 10% increase in overwinter survival, which can be pretty significant for bobwhite. So just an example of hardwood removal and going from there. An intensive forest system. So the take-home message there is Cooper's hawks are doing a lot of that mortality, and Cooper's hawks populations are drastically increasing. You can't really manage for Cooper's hawks legally. You can't shoot them, but you can manage the forest structure by removing hardwood timber, softening edges, and restoring prescribed fire that will benefit survival. I've probably gone over my time. I quit paying attention to it, but I'll end there. Here's my contact information. If anyone has any questions on this talk or any other topic that we discussed or didn't discuss, I'm happy to help. I'm here in the Warnell School.
Yep, let's take just a few questions here.
David, we got time for questions?
There's a couple on clear cutting. Is that an easy solution to provide the least frequent and most needed forest type that you cited early, that is that early successional stage?
Yeah, I would say clear cutting is the way you're going to get at the early successional habitat the quickest, but there's other issues there with, one, depending on what kind of land you're managing. If it's private land or public land, the public's not too keen on a lot of clear cuts. They're typically now with SFI, I think, wants them down to 50 acres maybe. But yeah, you can definitely you're going to get the fastest response on a good high site index from a clear cut, but then you've got to, what you do with a clear cut by not leaving any residual trees, you're basically just at the mercy of whatever comes up. Whereas with a group selection or a shelter wood, you can very more slowly and systematically shift to the desired plant community you want.
Yeah, and I'll follow up. There's another question about, is that method most likely to yield more exotic invasive plant infestations? It
depends on where you're at. So if you have exotics in the area, like Johnson grass or anything like that, yes, absolutely, you're gonna release them, and that's where you want to be very cautious and come in with chemical control.
Right.
To manage those. But yeah, that is a risk if it's in the area.
Is there any benefit to all this invasive privet that we have everywhere?
Oh man, that's an excellent question. So I'm trying to get a research project started right now to look at how American woodcock respond to privet thickets in riparian systems in the southeast. Deer will eat privet, birds eat privet seeds, there's no doubt about it, and one of the reasons we have such an expanse of Chinese privet is because of birds massively consuming the seeds and then spreading them all over the world, and then of course they regenerate. But in general, it is considered an exotic invasive that is doing more harm than good because it outcompetes native plant communities. And when if you've ever walked through a privet thicket, there's nothing else growing there, right? So you're taking a diverse system to a monoculture of privet. Woodcock are using privet to some degree in Georgia on the river systems here, because it's the only similar structural component to maybe traditional cane or things that we obviously don't have much of anymore. So a lot of people woodcock hunt in privet thickets, but I would argue that we'd have a better, every wildlife species would benefit from eradication of privet to a native plant community than an exotic. Good question.
And birds will eat privet berries, but those privet fruits are essentially junk food for birds. It's stuff to eat, but it doesn't really do a lot for them energetically. So it's not the best food out there.
It's kind of like a quick fill, whereas a native seed source, something they would have evolved with, would definitely, absolutely, David, I'm glad you mentioned that. They will definitely, but they still defecate it and spread it.
Yeah.
The birds don't know it's bad for their diet.
Right. Does commercial fertilizer improve forage protein? And if so, if not, what other means could be used?
Yeah, there's some good research on this from Mississippi. Whoever that is, you can shoot me an email and I'll try to get you that. In Mississippi, they looked at some thinning and burning and herbicide, but and then adding fertilizing a forest stand to see what it did for deer forage quality, and it definitely increases it. I would say that in most systems, in productive systems, it's not terribly necessary. Deer can only process so much protein anyway. The rest comes out in urea, and so if you're getting above a certain threshold of the protein content of the forest, it's kind of like taking a 3,000 milligram vitamin C pill. You're not getting 3,000 milligrams of vitamin C to benefit your immune system. But yeah, there are options there, and it can work. It's relatively expensive, but in general, the appropriate thinning with an active fire regime will provide more than enough of the forage potential that you need in terms of protein and palatability and digestibility.
Okay. And what was the acreage of that Noxubee National Wildlife Refuge case study in Mississippi?
I'd have to look that up. I used to take students out there when I was there all the time. I don't know how big the whole place is. I want to say it's about I'm trying to think, at least from just the parts I've taken students to, at least 40 to 60 acres. It may be bigger than that, though. I can look that up. We use it as a demo site, or we did when I was at Mississippi State. Forestry students and the WISE students go out there pretty regularly, and they've got some long-term bird monitoring there. But chemical control is relatively expensive, and that's usually what most people's hindrance is. And I'll add this. The reason chemical control was needed there was the sweet gums were already over your head. When sweet gums get over your head, and granted that's subjective, I'm 6'3", if the sweet gum over my head, it's past the point where a responsible prescribed fire is actually going to kill it permanently. It's going to top kill it maybe. When the sweet gum get over your head, pretty much your only option is chemical control. And that's why they had to go to that. In general, though, if you can have an aggressive but wise prescribed fire plan, you can chip away at sweet gum, especially if it's not above your head yet, and top kill it enough to set it back and allow native or more herbaceous grassland plants to grow.
All right, so